10 minutes, yes. I dropped some of my notes. Rewritten this about 5 times, changed my mind about 5 times, and was doing so as she was introducing us. So who knows whether this is going to be coherent? I don't promise that. As I look at the relationship of theology and education over the years, I'm aware that theology itself in recent centuries, actually 4 centuries, has had a rather severe dilemma or tension within its midst, which I think impacts our educational endeavors significantly. Theology, in all 3 of the Abrahamic traditions, is convinced that there is one God who has created and continues to create and sustains the entire universe and all of us in it. And we have also spent years and centuries debating how our way of seeing and responding to this God is different from and better than the others. To the point, to the extent that our way is the only way, and God will damn all other gods and other children of that God who don't think like us. I don't see how you hold it both ways. God creates and loves the world, but wants some of its people not to be his, or hers, or God's. That's a problem, it seems to me. How can that be? One of the things I have learned to respect from my colleagues, Gabe and Ann, is that they are willing and have challenged our conventional expectations about how to be God's people in educational ways. They've both shown consistently how religious education done well moves beyond the confines of conventional theology and church buildings or school settings and takes seriously the world and the diverse people among whom we live without insisting that they must look like us or think like us. They've shown us how to respect our neighbors, to learn from them, and to engage them in more creative and profound ways. As I think about our topic, I don't think there is a way of relating theology and education. As Jack Seymour and others have shown, there are many ways of legitimately relating theologies and educational endeavors because we have different purposes in mind. And those purposes, therefore, call forth different responses or are responding to different ways of thinking about God and the world. My years of engagement with the wisdom traditions suggest to me that there are 2 very basic things we need to be paying attention to. One of the characteristics of the ancient wisdoms is that they have this ability to boil things down to very simple equations or maxims. 2 realities that we must take very seriously, which are ancient realities, and yet these realities must be learned over and over again because we seem to keep forgetting them or turning them off or turning our attention somewhere else. Yet I think they're inexhaustible in their profundity, and they continue to illumine wide ranges of living. For example, within these 3 Abrahamic traditions, there is one thing on which all 3 agree is absolutely fundamentally basic to a relationship with God. They all have the same maxim. It boils down to love God and love your neighbor. Rock bottom basic in all 3 faiths. Pedagogically, we might ask, what is this? Is this doctrine? Or is this a way of living? Is this a set of beliefs? Or is this a set of practices that we must engage in? Is this product of loving God and loving other people as our neighbors a result of mastering some theologically sophisticated formulas? Does one become a being that is essentially loving of both God and God's creatures? Is that an outcome of a schooling paradigm or something that we have learned? If it is learned, how is it learned? Is it book learning? Can it be taught? And if so, how can it be taught? I wonder sometimes if we aren't misled because we come with preconceptions which blind us to some things. Let me give you a very simple example of that, a classic example. I'll bet you all know a proverbial saying by heart, Proverbs 22:6. You know what I mean? Okay, I'll give you a clue. Let me start it, you can finish it. Train up a child in, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Yes, it's masculine. Could be feminine just as well. But that's not what the Hebrew text says. The Hebrew text says, train up a child in his own way, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That's rather different, folks. In fact, one chapter later, 23:19 in Proverbs, listen, my son, and get wisdom, lead your mind in a proper path, says the English text. The Hebrew text says, walk in the way of your own heart, or walk in the path your own heart chooses. Rather different again. Now, I can see the King James translators sitting around living in Britain where children are not to be heard or seen. And these scholars are translating this Hebrew text, and well, we know that can't be. We know what it should be. They should follow the proper path, and we'll tell them what that proper path is. That's what parents are for, right? So what we expect has changed what the text says. And the pedagogical difference in those two frames is rather fundamental, it suggests to me. Now, this way of thinking, the biblical way, the Hebrew way of thinking of it, requires that somebody discern what is the child's own way and then help them to live that. That might create a lot less tension in a family. Or would it? At any rate, does this then suggest that we are in a position to say that loving is something that comes with nature, or is it something that must be learned? Maybe we are sometimes misled about what it means when we start talking about loving one another, because in our culture, most often, loving is thought as some kind of a feeling. But how can that then be commanded? Because thou shalt love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. That's a command. Love one another. That's an imperative. You don't command feelings. You can command activities which demonstrate the presence of love. Behavior which is loving behavior. So I suggest that this is quite consistent with what happened when the disciples came, John's disciples came and asked Jesus if he was the one. And he said, go and tell John what I do. That's the answer. His behavior showed who he was. Now, what that suggests to me is that theology has a role in criticizing, comparing, making sense of behavior to see whether or not it is loving behavior. But in that regard, theology then is in a subservient, aiding role, not a kingship role. Much like Educators are servants, not lords, serving the learner, serving the community who's trying to raise a population that loves God. So we must know and discern what they need to do and how we can help people learn to do. Now, this is a little unsettling, perhaps, and let me simply close with a comment by Mark Twain, which I have often quoted. Mark Twain, of all people, not exactly a highly religious person in most people's estimation, once said, "Many are disturbed by the sayings in the Bible which they find hard to understand. I'm disturbed by the sayings in the Bible that I do understand."
I have 8 points which I will make in 10 minutes. Point 1. I wrote a book 30 years ago entitled Interplay, The Relation of Religion and Education. I take that metaphor to be somewhat similar to dance, maybe a little less intimate. I still think that the fundamental meaning of religious education is the relation between religion and education, that is the most logical, comprehensive, and forward-looking meaning for religious education. As such, I think it is an issue which is urgent for our country and for the world, and that the REA in its original mission of 1903 had it right, that what we need is an educational ideal for religion and a religious ideal for education. Point 2, the difficulty, however, is the ambiguity of both of those partners. The reason why the Religious Education Association has never flourished, the reason why religious education is a field which is still struggling to be born, is the ambiguity in both of the partners, religion and education. Most people, I think, are somewhat aware that there's an ambiguity in the word education. Even though in the mid-19th century, the word education became largely conflated with school. So we're not sure what education is, but we know that you go to school to get some of it. Even so, I think most people have some sense, some awareness of, thank you, of an older and deeper meaning of education. My focus, however, right now is just on the meaning of religion or religious, where I think there is not as much awareness of the radical ambiguity of the term religion or religious. Briefly, the term religion was coined by Cicero to describe devotion to the gods. Christianity, that is the Christian church, took over that meaning, and it remained pretty much that way until the late 16th century. Thomas Aquinas, for example, treats religion as an aspect of the virtue of justice. Even John Calvin, writing in the 16th century, talks about Christian religion as meaning devotions of a Christian. A century later, the meaning Christian religion would have been quite fundamentally different. As happens when a word nearly reverses in meaning, which actually happens quite often, is that the older meaning doesn't disappear, and both meanings are still present in the language and cause constant confusion. For example, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution is a mess. It doesn't really have much meaning other than what lawyers say it means. And we will never get a discussion of religion in the state schools of this country until legal experts stop confusing religion as religious devotions in contrast to religion as something that can be intelligibly studied in school. Point 5. The two meanings of religion, one as religious devotion, the other as a plurality of institutions, necessarily give birth to two different parts of religious education. That religious education has two parts which are not only different, but in severe tension with one another. That is, that religious education can mean and should mean the teaching and learning of the practice of religion. But it also means the teaching of understanding of religion and religions. The two meanings of religion, as I say, are in considerable conflict because in the older meaning of religion, there was only one religion, or if you like, one true religion. In the modern meaning of religion, there is necessarily a plurality of religions, even when only one religion is being spoken about. The first kind of religious education, that is the practice of religious devotion, is taught almost entirely by example and by ritual. People practice religion long before they've ever heard of the word theology. I'm not against having theology come in at some point to provide, as it were, the content or the backstory for the religious practices that already exist. That story about religious practices is what Christians call theology. And I must note that at least in the United States, maybe not in Europe, in the United States, the term theology is used almost exclusively of Christianity. That's the problem. Maybe it can change. I don't know if it can change. But it is, I think, a fact. What Christians call this story is theology, and therefore, when Christians engage in this kind of religious education, they may call it theology, but theology needs religious education more than vice versa. People practice religion. People don't practice theology. In the other part of religious education, the study of institutions that embody religious traditions, there is a need, obviously, for a content which for Christians is supplied largely through theology. Not entirely, but largely through theology, some history or psychology or sociology. And this is done largely, if not exclusively, in classrooms. I think when Christian tradition is the subject of study in a classroom, then it should be called religion and not theology. At least again in this country, to put the tag of theology on it is to unnecessarily restrict its possibility of dialogue with other religions. Also, whether you like this or not, I think it is the common understanding that the term theology gives an ecclesiastical stamp to what is being dealt with. And the problem of orthodoxy or heresy for some people becomes quite important. As far as I'm concerned, orthodoxy does not belong in a classroom, except insofar as a classroom ought to be opposed to all orthodoxies, theological, political, and otherwise. My final point, number 8. I'm all in favor of a dialogue between theology and both parts of religious education. The biggest problem, it seems to me, is that theologians are not interested, and it takes two to have a dialogue. In order to have a dialogue, religious educators would have to know a good bit about theology, and I think most do. Even Muslim or Jewish educators could profit by learning some Christian theology, if only for survival. I think that theologians have to be in touch with both parts of religious education if there is to be a dialogue. That is, that theologians would have to learn something about how religion is actually practiced, and on the other hand, that theology would have to understand how to approach the study of one religion in the context always of many religions. Until that happens, I don't see much possibility for a working dialogue between theology and religious education. Thank you.
How do we make the connections between religious education and theology? Well, I want to propose that narrative is a practical theological method. And I want to say something about how that happens. And I want to do it by starting with a gospel song that says, when I look back over my life and I think things over, I can truly say, I've been blessed, I got a testimony. And the testimony couldn't come without somehow making a reflection in a conversation with God and what God has done in this gospel writer's thinking and heart. But I also want to suggest that when we look back over our lives, and I did in preparing for this, we come face to face and hear the testimonies of others that come through questions and comments based on their lives. Let me share some with you. I recall, for example, overhearing the stories of joy on the one hand of young women in the New Mexico school with which I began my teaching career, which was a mission school, of Mexican, Mexican-American, Indian, and African-American girls who on graduation day declared themselves Harwood girls, who made it against the odds by God's grace and declared the determination to believe in God's promises and follow the teachings of Jesus. But on the other hand, I was aware that young Indian girls at Harwood sang, "Jesus loves me, this I know," and explored its meaning in class, while out of class, I observed them weeping and asking, "Why?" as the popular westerns of that day appearing on TV revealed time and time again the obliteration of Indian tribal members. In passing conversations, I also overheard and interacted with black males in the youth theology program at ITC who punctuated their stories of racial profiling with the question, "So what? Who cares? Who are we anyway?" And at the Hospitality Center for Homeless People, where I was the director, I overheard a homeless woman named Rose say, "God does bad things to good people." And she felt that God had done that to her. Now, outside of class, a seminary student told me of struggling with God about his pacifist leanings that prompted his disagreement with current military involvement and difficulty in saying goodbye to a recent high school graduate in his group who had joined the armed services and was being deployed to the Middle East. In a different way, students from distant lands and different polities have shared outside class their query to God, "Why did you call me here?" In the throes of struggling with views of social behavior and religious views that conflict with their own, only to experience what they call the silent God. Another seminary student simply told in an informal conversation of asking daily, "What's God up to?" and "Help me, Holy Spirit," as a daily mantra born of her quest for answers to the next step in her life as a woman in ministry, only to discover that the answers didn't come easily or appeared at a time to be short-circuited. Still another, who had converted to Christianity, told of his seeking meaning in this new religious home, while daily questioning God, "What am I to do?" as he struggled to live the Christian faith found in Scripture and to discern God's direction in seeking reconciliation with his family and community whose faith he now denies. And in table conversation with a youth about the experience of undergraduate studies, he simply said, "Well, it's like this. I just say to myself, it's you and me, God. God and me, we're tight." But there was also an ex-gang member who spoke to the youth in the theology program for high school youth and told of his gang affiliation and of having been in prison. He had not had a history of church or religious education involvement, but he spoke of God's dealing with him and of his arriving at a point of recognition that his life situation had not been God's fault, but had evolved from his own decisions in the heat of difficult home and community circumstances. And a former student of mine, Lillian Ferguson, who's here today, who works in a program assisting adolescent offenders transitioning from incarceration to community, told of an ex-gang member who posed the question, "How can God ever forgive me?" Now, in all of these statements and questions, persons have been in conversation really with God. The questions are to God. And these are happening outside of religious education context. But how do we bring them inside the religious education context? And they, of course, are the questions and the comments and the queries, not just of individuals of all ages and stages, but they are queries of seminary students and leaders themselves. And how are those brought into the context of religious education? So first, I want to highlight my observation that there is an apparent necessary and ongoing engagement of people in doing theology outside religious education contexts, wherever those are, and by persons who are not affiliated with the context. But yet they connect their lived stories and theologizing in an interrelated fashion. The stories on the outside in the nitty-gritty of life are revelatory of a contextualized doing theology that reflects an interplay of the human and divine, human to human, and human to and within environmental experiences. This doing theology includes people's questioning, anticipating, processing, testifying, and deciding actions from where they are along the way. It reflects convictions, beliefs, and attitudes quickened for some by the proverbial bump in the road that occasioned a sort of redoing theology and a re-envisioned action. Now, my assumptive point is that the stories and theologizing done on the outside are revelatory of an organic interconnectedness of human, contextual, environmental, and transcendent realities. They reveal something of an intuitive knowing that we are created for the divine-human relationship. We are created in such a way that we yearn for, inquire of, lament to God, and praise God. Or, as St. Augustine recalled in his Confessions, "Thou hast formed us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they find rest in thee." The ways in which people connect their stories and theology on the outside affirm this. And to the extent that this is recognized in religious education, the potential for the more can occur in religious education context, wherever they are, and in the lives of those who are preparing for leadership. And the more to which I refer is the deepening wisdom formation that becomes possible when people are invited to grapple with their stories, or, as Tom Groom reminds us in his posting and in his blog, that people come into the religious education environment, wherever that is, and are invited to bring their stories and agree, disagree, or add to what has emerged in the doing theology. And in that give and take, it becomes a resource for their liberation and empowerment in faith. Now, briefly, my second point is that interconnectedness of the divine-human relationship is not just the individuals, it's also the individual in community. And so we are reminded of the multiple communities in which we live in our global village today. And we are reminded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his lecture on the occasion of receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in December 1964, we have indeed inherited a big house, a great world house, the oikumene, in which we have to live together, black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentiles and Jews, Catholics and Protestants, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interests, who, because we can never live without each other, must learn somehow in this one big world to live with each other. The questions that are raised, the stories that are brought, are from across the cultures in which we connect today in our global village. Do we bring them in? How do we bring them in? My third point is that we do that by engaging in a methodology that I call IDEA: inquiry, discovery, exploration, and application. Inquiry is particularly important because people naturally ask the questions of God. And they do it because they really do want the answer. Those questions: why? What's God up to? Who am I anyway? How can God ever forgive me? Thus, inquiry is that initial movement in idea that invites the questions people raise in their stories. It's important, and I built on Freire's Pedagogy of Hope, because to him, to enter into story is to enter into questions of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And it insists that the questions of where we've been in that journey and where we are and where we're going need to be answered. They call into the dance an interrelatedness of religious education and theology, or what he calls an epistemological curiosity about what it is that's going on. And it calls on us to form in persons and ourselves an epistemologically curious posture in which we're saying we need to know. I won't go into the remainder of the methodology, but I do want to close with the question, so how do we dance? Well, we dance as we dare to bring the questions that are raised outside of religious education, the comments about persons' relationship with God outside of religious education into the context of religious education. And we dare to bring our own questions. Because in engaging the questions of others and the comments of others in the relationship with God of others, as well as ourselves, we embody what it means to prepare persons for leadership in religious education. So how do we dance? The process of engaging persons in that relationship by bringing their stories and their questions and comments is what I call a holy dance. But I also want to say that insofar as we do that, the outcome is also a holy dance. Now, the holy dance in the Pentecostal tradition is one that is really very, very spirited. The holy dance comes from people making connections. It comes from that aha moment that says, I got it. I really know I'm related to God. I really know God relates to me. I really know where I'm going next in my life because of what we've done together. Once we do that, we say the holy dance has been operant all the time, and we can also say, I've been a part of that holy dance. I'm inspired by it.
All right, thank you, panelists. Put your button on. I wanted to start with Chuck, actually, because I was very struck by the story about the King James and the translation in a particular direction. And I think what you said was that why did this happen? Because the translators felt, well, it has to be this way because that's the way we understand child rearing implicitly. So the further implication then is God must have meant it this way. And so I think that's really interesting to reflect on in terms of what we do, because we necessarily translate in any kind of education. And how is it that we're presuming God's activity in the way that we frame what we should be doing?
Well, I think you're quite right that translating is inevitable. And the difficulty, of course, is when you're translating across centuries and cultures, if you do not understand that other culture, your translation is likely to almost always be distorted by your own convictions and your own presuppositions. And so the only loving thing to do is to try to understand that culture on its own terms before you complete your translation. And that's very hard to do with ancient cultures. Very hard to do, because the presuppositions are often so different from our own, and we don't have written records except these few isolated texts. Now, we have more records now, that's helping. But that's an ongoing issue.
I think it reminds me of a different kind of translation from one religion to another. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the Sermon on the Mount as a classic example of the way in which the editors have arranged that and some of the things that are said to emphasize the opposition between Christian and Jewish. The most obvious case being where it says an eye for an eye. Presumably Jesus knew what the verb was and didn't leave it out. And most Christians in reading that assume that the verb there is to take an eye for an eye. If you look up Exodus 21:24, it says give an eye for an eye, a foot for a foot, a hand for a hand. That is in fact addressed to the person who should be seeking to repair the, rather than to exercise vengeance. And all through, in fact, the example of loving your neighbor, which is really Jesus saying to do love to your enemies. It's often, I mean, I've read so many interpretations by non-Christians ridiculing the whole idea, whereas if it were better translated or understood, it's in fact a way of de-hostilizing the enemy to actually do good to one's enemy, quite possible.
Yeah. The difficulty is we come to texts like that which are so uncomfortable because we don't want to do that we then find some other interpretation to make ourselves more comfortable.
Yes, I was particularly struck with the telos, the love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and spirit. Well, you didn't add all of that, and your neighbor as yourself, because in a narrative methodology, the story becomes the link that allows people to appreciate one another and grow to love them. You can't argue with a story. A story is as it is, and you accept it. You may challenge it. You may ask further questions so people can test it out, but nonetheless, it is their story, and it's their story in relationship to whatever the transcendent dimension is that they are related to. So it's a way of loving God and loving neighbor through a story.
I think I'd like to raise a question about that, because one of the things that biblical stories, we have lots of them, but we know that they are told from a point of view. And that may not be what actually happened. It's what I think it happened, or it's what I now remember happened after I filtered it through several years of thinking about it. And so there needs to be a dialogue with the storyteller about the truthfulness of the story, whether it's a biblical story or a personal story, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. But it's in the dialogue that we come to appreciate what is presented and what is given.
I was thinking about what both Gabriel and Anne were talking about with their use of terms, and I wondered if the two of you looked at what each other said in terms of the doing of theology with Anne, and I think if it's not too much of a stretch, the doing of religion that Gabriel brings up. And I wonder if you would see those two approaches as fundamentally dissimilar, as having some kind of resonance with each other or overlap.
I know the phrase doing theology is popular and says something to people, but I frankly don't understand it. I agree. You can do anything, I suppose, but I use the word practice with a particular history in mind of the whole discussion in the 20th century, especially of the fact that theory can only emerge out of practice and then becomes a guide to further practices. Whatever theologians say about what they're doing, it's still a theoretical venture as far as I can see, which is nothing bad with that. I make my living largely like this, but is a reflection upon the life as lived, and that's why I claim that theology is in urgent need of a dialogue with educators and with people who we might describe as not having engaged these things in an academic way, but nonetheless have a very determined narrative about their life, that there can be an educational bridge between whatever is theorized and is part of our historical tradition and part of the meaning that we want to carry forward for the next generation, that is needs to be in touch with people who are just parents of children who are the first as we say, they're first teachers, though we don't really believe that, I don't think, or people who engage in schools and other kinds of education and teaching, the people who are theorizing necessarily use big words, which I try to avoid, and constructs, conceptual things that get pretty far distant from ordinary life, unless there's someone who has a sense of how you, like yourself, who bring that into bear with our life that isn't necessarily characterized as either theological or religiously educational.
My own understanding of doing theology is to represent what actions people are taking to reflect. It's an active kind of reflection as opposed to being. Certainly the being self is particularly important because the being self really is standing back and perhaps taking in what is going on in one's life before one then begins to act on it. And one of the actions taken is that of reflection.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And in the interest of our extended conversations in smaller groups,